The chamber unfolded like a cathedral of light and geometry, walls bending at angles that seemed to defy Euclidean principles, and yet somehow held together, shimmering as if the metal itself had decided to stay polite. The delegates arrived in precise rotations of color and shape, some with elongated torsos that glittered with bioluminescent veins, others with clusters of delicate floating orbs circling their heads, each programmed to reflect mood, or at least that was the rumor. At the far end of the hall, the human ambassador hesitated at the threshold, trying not to trip over the hover screens that hummed with projected star charts, treaties, and procedural bylaws. Of course, he failed spectacularly, catching his foot on a maintenance drone, sending it spinning and causing a rain of hollow documents to swirl around him like an interstellar snowstorm. A few delegates flickered their eyes in surprise, while others leaned into the spectacle, curious to see if humans were always this awkward. He straightened, muttering something about gravity miscalculations, and tried to find a seat among the floating panels that adjusted height and angle for each species' physiology. That was when she appeared, stepping lightly from a corridor of refracted light, her silver-blue skin catching every hue in the room and reflecting it with a subtle shimmer. Her hair, long and silver, curled slightly at the ends as though teasing gravity itself, and her eyes glimmered like molten amber caught between two suns. She moved with an elegance that seemed at odds with the chaos of a chamber built on rules so old that even time might have forgotten them. A small cluster of delegates shifted uneasily, whispering in harmonic tones, while she raised a hand in a gesture that was somehow both commanding and teasing, her voice carrying the weight of reason and a hint of playful mischief. The session opened with the usual formalities, speeches, acknowledgments, and an endless recitation of procedural guidelines projected in looping holograms. It was all going smoothly until the alien woman leaned forward, just enough to tilt her head, and pointed out a loophole so obvious it should have been invisible. The rule mandating sequential address of each planetary faction didn't apply when a delegate's gravity field was unstable. A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber, punctuated by one delegate's sphere of light spinning into another, eliciting a series of metallic squeaks as it collided. The human ambassador, still trying to recover from his earlier collision, choked on a sip of nutrient gel and sputtered, narrowly avoiding what would have been an intergalactic faux pas. His coughing fit somehow set off the chamber's etiquette bot, which began issuing polite but increasingly frantic warnings about bodily fluid contamination in diplomatic zones, causing laughter to echo like soft chimes across the crystalline walls. The alien woman did not flinch, only gave a faint smile and raised a finger, which caused a tiny constellation of spark-like motes to hover and orbit her in miniature. "If we follow that logic," she said, voice smooth as liquid starlight, "we might find ourselves debating the orbit of a single shuttle for an entire solar cycle." A ripple of amusement swept through the delegates. Even the gravely serious photonic envoys twinkled in bemusement. The human ambassador blinked, caught between admiration and envy, realizing that here was someone who could disarm centuries of tradition with a quip that was also rigorously accurate. By mid-session, the debates had taken on an almost theatrical quality. Holographic charts spun like carousel horses, committees argued over whether floating gestures constituted an insult, and the human ambassador found himself explaining Earth humor to a delegation of four-dimensional beings who interpreted irony as a minor temporal disruption. At one point, an errant drone mistook a delegate's hovering orb for a snack and zipped after it, prompting a small chase that had several delegates twisting through the air, shouting in harmonic registers, while the chamber's ceiling lights pulsed in sympathetic laughter. Through it all, the alien woman remained a calm, luminous center, occasionally tilting her head to wink at the human, as if acknowledging the absurdity without ever allowing it to erode the gravity of the discussion entirely. By the close of the session, no treaties had been signed, no decisions finalized, but the chamber was alive in a way it had not been for decades. Laughter and light intermingled with solemnity and strategy. The human ambassador, exhausted but exhilarated, realized that perhaps the true art of diplomacy lay not in rigid adherence to protocol, but in knowing when to trip, sputter, and laugh, letting humanity slip into the cracks of an otherwise perfect system. And as the delegates floated away, murmuring and recalibrating, the alien woman's amber eyes met his once more, gleaming with the promise of both challenge and camaraderie, leaving him to wonder if surviving the first session was triumph, or merely the opening act of something infinitely more unpredictable. The council chamber buzzed with an uneasy energy, not the tense silence of past sessions, but something more like a beehive where every delegate seemed simultaneously busy and distracted. Hollow boards flickered erratically as if reacting to the mood of the room, projecting charts that refused to stay straight, looping laws that contradicted themselves, and a few entirely nonsensical amendments about the proper orbit of ceremonial drones. In the midst of this, a human diplomat adjusted the straps of a hovering briefcase, which protested by slowly spinning him in 3 directions at once. He stumbled and nearly collided with a pod of delegates whose limbs floated freely in microgravity, each limb adorned with glittering rings that denoted rank, authority, and in some cases, personal flair. The human mumbled something about gravitational etiquette, while the alien woman, standing nearby with a faint glow around her silver-blue skin, raised a hand and let a few levitating motes orbit her like tiny satellites. The first wave of withdrawals began almost innocuously. One delegate, claiming that a sudden photonic migraine required an urgent retreat to a private chamber, disappeared into a shimmer of light and anti-gravity folds, leaving a brief echo of irritation and the faint scent of ozone. Another claimed a temporal misalignment in their home quadrant, and a moment later their seat folded into itself and vanished. The human diplomat watched with a mixture of awe and horror, realizing that protocol enforcement systems, sleek, polished, and usually infallible, had begun arguing among themselves about whether they should chase after the missing delegates or continue projecting holographic agendas. The argument took the form of a looped voice, polite at first, gradually increasing in frustration as each bot accused the other of malfunctioning in the face of unprecedented human-style unpredictability. Amid the confusion, the alien woman stepped forward, her eyes flickering like twin moons as she tilted her head and made a comment about redundancy in the rules. A ripple of laughter followed, not mockery, but the kind of amusement that spreads quietly through beings who recognize cleverness. The human diplomat attempted to mimic her poise, only to misjudge a floating panel and send it spinning into a neighboring delegate. "Ah, Earth customs," he muttered, shrugging apologetically, while the other delegate twinkled with amusement, admitting through harmonic tones that the maneuver, though clumsy, was effective in grabbing attention. The debate quickly devolved into a bizarre mixture of strategic discussion and improvised comedy. One faction demanded that all voting be accompanied by synchronized gestures, arguing that it reflected planetary harmony. Another insisted that chairs must be temporarily inverted to ensure unbiased gravity perspectives. At one point, an errant maintenance drone, confused by the alien woman's levitating motes, began chasing them in a spiraling pattern, nudging several delegates into awkward tumbles that elicited gentle chuckles across the chamber. Even the gravely serious ambassadors from crystalline worlds shimmered with what could only be described as amusement, their forms vibrating in harmonic resonance with the humor. In the midst of the chaos, the human diplomat realized the peculiar advantage of unpredictability. Each laugh, each minor accident, each absurd procedural debate chipped away at centuries of rigid protocol, forcing delegates to improvise and reconsider their positions. The alien woman's interventions were never blunt or aggressive. Instead, she punctuated her points with subtle, wry humor, a flick of her wrist, a tiny spark of light, a carefully timed pause that made the absurdity of some rules impossible to ignore. She seemed to delight in the unintentional comedy that humanity brought, yet she wielded it like a scalpel, cutting through the inertia of tradition without breaking it entirely. By mid-session, some delegates began floating away in fits of polite exasperation, citing personal crises, sudden allergies to artificial light, or urgent communiques from home planets. The Council's procedural bots were caught in loops of self-contradiction, issuing polite warnings to holograms, chairs, and occasionally themselves. The human diplomat found himself at the center of it all, realizing that laughter and minor chaos had become tools of diplomacy, more effective than threats or speeches. The alien woman smiled faintly, a gesture that caused the orbiting motes around her to pulse in time, and nodded toward him as if granting permission to embrace the absurdity. By the end of the session, no formal resolutions had been passed, and yet something profound had shifted. The Council, usually rigid and implacable, had been forced to accommodate unpredictability, to bend without breaking. Humor, wit, and human improvisation had proven more disruptive, and perhaps more constructive, than any rigid procedural argument. As delegates prepared to leave, some shaking heads, others chuckling, the human diplomat and the alien woman shared a brief glance. A silent acknowledgement that in the grand theater of interstellar politics, laughter could be as powerful a tool as any law, and that the unpredictable, principled presence of humanity could ripple through centuries of carefully constructed order, with nothing more than a well-timed stumble or a mischievous smile. The council chamber had begun to resemble less a place of solemn diplomacy and more a stage for improvised interstellar theater. Hollow projections whirled like dizzying constellations, charts spinning and reforming midair, while gravity fields wavered as if laughing at themselves. Delegates floated in and out with such unpredictability that even the procedural enforcement bots were forced into existential crises, arguing about whether missing delegates violated the code of conduct or simply the laws of physics. Somewhere, a human diplomat stumbled again, caught in a tangle of levitating wires and a chair that refused to stay put, narrowly missing a photonic envoy whose entire form shimmered in what might have been indignation, or maybe amusement. The chamber's laughter, unexpected and melodic, echoed through the high ceilings, a chorus of disbelief, delight, and nervous mirth. The alien woman appeared in the center of it all, her silver-blue skin catching fragments of refracted light like scattered starlight. She extended a hand, and a few motes of light began orbiting her in precise, miniature patterns, performing a kind of synchronized dance that drew the attention of every delegate, forcing even the most obstinate to pause and acknowledge her presence. She made a point about the absurdity of enforcing seating arrangements, when half the attendees were drifting randomly through microgravity, her voice calm but threaded with humor that sparkled like a secret code. The human diplomat, caught mid-collision with a levitating dossier, blinked, realizing that she had once again punctuated her logic with comedic timing that softened critique into charm. A few delegates tried to mimic the gestures, sending motes of light scattering chaotically across the room, much to the delight of the assembly. Arguments began over the smallest of procedural points, each more surreal than the last. One faction insisted that voting should be done in inverted gravity, claiming that perspective literally shifted decision-making. Another faction demanded the mandatory inclusion of interpretive dance to accompany speeches, insisting it communicated interstellar nuance better than words. A maintenance drone, confused by a particularly dramatic gesture from the alien woman, began spiraling through the chamber, nudging floating chairs and inadvertently creating a choreography of accidental collisions that had several delegates laughing while others glimmered with irritation. The human diplomat, balancing on a wobbling hover platform, muttered something about Earth entertainment value, while trying to salvage a falling stack of hollow documents, eliciting a few stifled chuckles from a species whose sense of humor had not been exercised in centuries. Amid the chaos, a cluster of delegates began to withdraw, citing bizarre emergencies. One claimed their personal light field was misaligned with galactic time, another cited sudden confusion over quantum etiquette, and a third announced a temporary need to recalibrate their personal gravity halo. Each departure left procedural bots in loops of polite admonishments, issuing warnings that grew more absurd with each new absence. The human diplomat leaned into the absurdity, realizing that subtle humor and unpredictability were slowly turning the chamber's rigid formality on its head, and that he could wield the strange influence of human improvisation without overstepping boundaries. The alien woman glanced at him with a fleeting smile, motes of light pulsing in acknowledgement, as if silently granting permission to embrace the delightful disorder. By mid-session, debates had reached a theatrical crescendo. Holocharts spun like carousel planets. Delegates argued over whether gestures constituted insults or compliments, and a few even debated the ethics of procedural drones making independent decisions. The alien woman interjected with logic that was precise but lightly sarcastic, exposing contradictions in centuries of council tradition while simultaneously amusing the assembly. Even the human diplomat found himself laughing at a procedural bot that insisted on issuing a reprimand to a projection of a delegate rather than the actual delegate, a bureaucratic farce that drew harmonized chuckles from multiple species. Gradually, the chamber began to bend under the weight of humor, wit, and human unpredictability, showing that sometimes influence came not from authority or force, but from the gentle disruption of expectations, a well-timed joke, or a stumble at the perfect moment. As the session wound down, no resolutions were finalized, but the chamber had been irrevocably altered. Delegates, now floating in varying states of amusement and exasperation, acknowledged, sometimes silently, sometimes with flickers of iridescent light, that the council's rituals could not contain the unpredictable, principled, and comically human interventions that had woven themselves into the session. The human diplomat, brushing off scattered motes and hollow documents, caught the alien woman's gaze one final time, her amber eyes gleaming with satisfaction and mischief. She offered a brief nod, a silent promise that the chaos, though seemingly minor, had changed the balance of influence in the council, and that the most unpredictable participants often wielded the greatest power. The chamber hummed with an energy that was both electric and absurd, as if the very air had absorbed the last several cycles of procedural chaos and laughter. Holocharts floated like constellations on caffeine, spinning and reshaping themselves, while the occasional delegate drifted sideways, caught mid-gesture in an awkward pirouette of microgravity. The human diplomat hovered near the center, balancing on a platform that occasionally wheezed complaints about supporting more weight than it was designed for, while clutching a stack of hovering dossiers that refused to align with any law of physics. He had learned over countless collisions, misplaced greetings, and accidental interventions that presence mattered more than precision, and that sometimes a stumble was more persuasive than a speech. The alien woman stood a few meters away, her silver-blue skin reflecting fragments of the chamber's chaotic light like a prism caught in motion. Her amber eyes glimmered, twin beacons of both patience and playful judgment, and the motes orbiting her wove complex, miniature patterns that drew every gaze. Today, she intervened not with confrontation but with subtle orchestration. A flick of a finger here, a slight nod there, encouraging the chamber itself to behave as if it were alive, participating in a dance of order and disorder. She glanced at the human diplomat, and he felt, for the first time, that the absurdity surrounding him was no longer threatening. It was a tool, a language he had begun to speak fluently. Delegates who had vanished during previous sessions began returning, citing minor emergencies, quantum recalibrations, or interstellar allergies with equal parts sincerity and theatricality. The procedural bots, long caught in recursive arguments, now attempted reconciliation, issuing tentative, almost apologetic warnings that drew gentle laughter. The human diplomat realized that what had once been a terrifying, rigid web of rules was now pliable, softened by humor, ingenuity, and audacious unpredictability. He stepped forward, carefully avoiding a pirouetting envoy from the crystalline worlds, and addressed a minor procedural contradiction, not with force or threat, but with a joke about Earth cuisine and temporal misalignment. The room stilled, then erupted into soft laughter, acknowledging both the absurdity and the insight in equal measure. The alien woman moved among the delegates, guiding them subtly toward consensus. She did not command or lecture. She encouraged, teased, and demonstrated that flexibility did not mean weakness. One by one, delegates proposed amendments, each slightly unconventional, each carrying a kernel of reason. Interpretive gestures were incorporated into voting procedures. Drones were allowed to orbit freely, but under soft coordination protocols. And the human diplomat found himself mediating between factions with an unanticipated authority. His earlier stumbles, the near collisions, the accidental humor, all had become instruments of influence, illustrating that disruption paired with reason could accomplish more than rigid adherence ever could. By the time the final discussions concluded, no laws had been overturned entirely, yet the council had transformed. Delegates who had been inflexible now acknowledged the necessity of adaptability. Procedural bots had learned to moderate themselves with humor, and the chamber's very atmosphere seemed to breathe more freely. The human diplomat, weary but exhilarated, realized that he had grown, not through brute intellect or formal power, but through observation, daring improvisation, and the courage to be human in a galaxy that often measured worth by precision and conformity. The alien woman approached him, motes circling faster now in what could only be interpreted as applause. She offered a small, wry smile, the kind that suggested approval and the gentle promise of continued partnership in disruption. As delegates departed, the chamber echoed with quiet laughter and whispered conversations. The previous tension dissolved into a memory that would become legend in council records. The human diplomat lingered briefly, watching motes of light settle like stars returning to rest, realizing that his journey through chaos, humor, and the subtle art of influence had reshaped not only the council but himself. He had learned that humanity's strength was not in obedience, but in